they are increasingly coveting the resources of Africa. You know, just as Asia and Africa suffered because of European and American colonialism,
the new imperialists.
It's possible. And I think India and China could be playing a great game at Africa's expense.
Why do you have to grow? I mean, you know, in India you say our growth is not as great as it was a couple of years ago. It's gone from 9% to 6%. But I mean, do you have to have growth? I mean, do you think you really need it?
To lift the people at the bottom of the heap, yes, in India and in China too.
Doesn't that inevitably mean that you're going to be riding roughshod over the concerns of people in Africa and the environment?
If you destroy natural resources, on one side, you're adding to GDP. Because if you destroy a whole forest, it actually goes to improve the top line of a company or institution or whatever. But the degradation is not really accounted for in that sense. Now, what Ram is talking about to that extent is also looking at the degradation in other parts of the world, which are extended footprints of our own country. Because that will be a price for us to pay in some period of time.
I think development is of paramount importance. But to achieve development, it does not mean that development itself does not need to be sustainable. In China's case, for example, every year there will be a need for 10 million extra jobs to be created every year, just to accommodate for the size increase in the population. Now, 1% GDP growth would translate roughly into 1 million to 1.2 million new jobs. So as a rule of thumb, China need to keep 8% GDP growth every year or above, just in order to accommodate for the increase in the jobs.
As a result of that, your government in Beijing, how many coal-fired power stations do you open every week? Quite a few. Still using fossil fuels left, right and centre. Lots of people wanting their cars and so on. So that is the reality. Your leaders have already decided that they're going to go to try to make sure they provide jobs and boost prosperity, and never mind about the environment.
No, the environment will be a key challenge for us. And I think in China, we need to raise this all the way to the top priority of the decision makers as well as the population as a whole. We need to have a new way of development which can enable the growth of the economy on the one hand, but also to minimize the damage to the environment.
Take one example, Ramachandra Guha, transport. I mean, transport emissions in the West account for something like 40% of total greenhouse gas emissions. Why don't you build a very efficient public transport system so people don't have to go and buy their cars, the nano car or whatever it is that's the latest craze?
I think it's still buy their cars, but use them sparingly. You know, I don't think it's an either or. I think public policy has to be oriented towards encouraging, mass transport. There are two key areas.
But are they? Is it? Is it being so in India?
It is not being done. But
it's
there's another even more serious area, Zainab, which is being neglected by both India and China, and that is water. Even more than energy and transport, the future of India and China depends on water. And the way both these countries, and probably other Asian countries like Malaysia and Vietnam too, are killing their rivers.
Your waters are being polluted.
And the groundwater depletion because of agriculture, which Ravi talked about. So I think water is as crucial as energy and transport, and regrettably, public policy is not paying enough attention to.
Victor Gao, something that we often hear from the Chinese is that, look, we do want the clean technology so we can have clean coal and that kind of thing, but we don't have the know-how, and we're relying on the West to transfer that technical knowledge to us. But surely the Chinese can do a lot for themselves.
Yes, you're right. I think several years ago, there were lots of people in China who thought that the talk about global warming was a kind of a conspiracy by the Western developed countries to deprive developing countries like China and India of their right to development. But now I think more and more people in China think along a different line. That is, regardless of the intent of the developed countries, we need to deal with this global warming, environmental protection head on. We cannot avoid our own responsibilities, and we need to find a better way of development, sustainable, and also by leapfrogging even to the forefront of the developed countries by using innovative technologies. Therefore, I think the challenge for us is not to point fingers in any direction, but to really remind ourselves of the importance of innovation and also identifying a new way of development.
Ramachandra Guha, is there a sort of new way, a middle way, a third way, whatever you want to call it, do you think?
In theory, in practice, much less so. There are some heartening examples. Our capital city, Delhi, very belatedly, but happily has now embraced an underground metro system, which will take the burden of cars off the roads. Perhaps other cities will follow. But in terms of incentives that Ravi talked about, those are not in place. In fact, the wrong side of incentives are in place. So easy soft bank loans to buy a private car rather than public funding of mass transit. So I think much more careful thinking needs to go into how to encourage innovation to produce sustainable technologies in energy, in water, in transport, in forest, in all these different sectors. And in many ways, our clamorous, cacophonous democracy, which has many other virtues, by no means do I want to give that side of it up. In many ways, the democracy and the competing shouting of so many different interests doesn't permit long-term, reflective, sustainable policy.
Ravi Singh, is there a third way? You often hear that talked about, that Asia actually can lead by example and not industrialise and modernise and become more prosperous in the same way that the old industrialised world did, relying on dirty fossil fuels.
There is a third way. And that way is firstly, in every aspect of the economy as we know it, there are sustainable practices that can be bettered and improved without too much cost. See, when we talk about transportation like in China or in Delhi, it requires a huge amount of capital. Capital is scarce. And capital cannot always flow in from other countries because it will come with conditionalities. India will not stand for those conditionalities.
Victor Gao, everybody's talking about the need, obviously, to have a successor to the Kyoto Treaty on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. And we know that Barack Obama, the new president, has been saying, yes, I want to do something, but I want China and India to be part of that. Would China accept legally binding targets on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in China that are internationally set? Do you think you've got that far that you would sign on the dotted line along with everybody else, including the US, if it does?
My personal view is that awareness is being increasing in China about the importance of combating environmental pollution and global warming. And I think with the passage of time, we definitely will come to the conclusion that any effort that the world will make without China, India, or United States or Japan's participation, or participation by other major countries, which in their turn are major polluters in their own way, will be a failure. And we will be faced with global consequences that future generations of mankind will hold us responsible. Therefore, I think it requires a new way of looking at the challenges as well as a collective way of solving this global challenge together.
I take that as a yes.
We are in
then.
the same boat.
I take that as a yes. You
Yes,
think
absolutely.
that the Chinese government will actually sign to internationally binding targets?
That's my hope.
If the US does, if the other big four
That's my
polluters do, India,
Yes.
China and the US, that's your hope and your expectation maybe.
You're right.
Ramachandra, go ahead. Do you think that India would also abandon this argument that the politicians have used and in these coming months perhaps sign as well?
Well, I think both India and China will look at what else is on the table. Apart from legally binding targets agreed upon, is there an inducement? Is there a commitment by America particularly to help with financial transfers, with subsidized technologies that may have been developed in America? I think there's going to be a lot of very hard bargaining before India and China particularly come on board in any new climate change protocol.
So you're still not sure?
I'm not that optimistic that it can so easily be achieved.
Ravi Singh, I mean, do you think India will heed the call of Barack Obama and say, yeah, OK, we're going to cooperate with everybody else?
We will cooperate, I think. But I agree with the fact that we are not sure, we are not sanguine that this is going to happen in its present form. And one of the reasons is that from the time that the first negotiations started, in the last 1 year or so, paradigms have changed. There's an economic downturn, there's a financial contagion, and to lift themselves up out of those nations who've been particularly affected, and largely the developed nations, it's inevitable that some of the industries and manufacturing would be brought into those very countries. Now, what effect it will have on climate change and the parameters, we really don't know. So the negotiations are going to be very, very critical and key. And they'll be changing aspects at this point of time. And therefore, it is our responsibility as parts of civil society to keep an eye on what's happening, to be able to explain to public what's going on, and maybe to some extent trying to help our governments to take the right kind of decisions.
Okay, Ravi Singh, you said that perhaps 5 years, that the clock is ticking, develop or die. You believe that that is really the scenario now. I mean, Victor Gao, do you think that that is true, that Asia must make sure that it develops in a sustainable way, otherwise it will just die?
Yes, my point is that we cannot think about the possibility of dying. We have to achieve development, but development in a new way, in a sustainable way. Only this way will be the future for mankind.
Ramachandra Guha?
I'd give it a slightly longer term perspective, being a historian, 40 or 50 years. And I'd quote Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi wrote 80 years ago that if India, and I would add China, develop in the manner of the West, they will strip the world bare like locusts. It was a prophetic statement. Yes. And we probably don't, we have a little more than 5 years, several decades in which, as Victor said, in which we can either show a new way or commit collective global suicide.
Well, what better place to end this discussion than on the thoughts of Mahatma Gandhi via you, Ramachandra Guha. Thank you very much indeed. Also, Victor Gao from China and Ravi Singh. Thank you all very much indeed. And that's all from this special debate, Develop or Die, coming to you from Mumbai. From me, Zainab Badawi, and everybody else here, goodbye.